Hello world, this is the Calamity Cat, and in this video I am going to give you an overview of how to create a glow-in-the-dark resin piece using glow-in-the-dark pigments from solarcolordust.com. Now this video is not really meant to be a step-by-step tutorial, but rather it's just sort of a general guideline on how to create a piece. And the first thing I've done is I've covered my workplace in silicone mats, so that way if I spill resin, it doesn't get all over my countertops, and it's very easy to remove from these mats. First you're going to need some resin, of course, and it usually comes in a hardener and the resin itself, and you'll just follow your manufacturer's directions on how to mix those. I've also got some measuring cups to mix them in, and some stir sticks. And I've got this really nifty brush. It's a silicone tipped brush, and basically it's just a piece of silicone on the tip of the brush. And I use this to mix the pigments. It really helps to keep them from clumping. Something else that helps are some spoons, and you'll see how these come into play a little later. Of course, I've got my pigments from solarcolordust.com to make this piece glow in the dark. I've also got some little scoops to scoop the pigments out, and I've got some eyeshadows which will help give the resin some color, as well as some white oil paint. I'll also be adding in some glitter, and these are just little stars, some white and some blue and some green. And last but not least, I of course will need a mold to pour the resin in and to make the actual piece. So the first thing you're going to do is pour out your resin and your hardener. And of course how much you pour depends on your manufacturer's directions. Some are a 1-to-1 ratio, some are a 2-to-1 ratio. Some is just a bunch of resin and a couple of drops of hardener. So you will just follow your manufacturer's directions in order to mix the resin. So I'm going to go ahead and mix these. Now for most resin you want to mix it really slow so that way you don't get any bubbles. Now if you're going to be making something that's not clear, that is not as important because you won't see the bubbles. And you want to take this and mix it until you don't see any more streaks in it. And I am going to stop for now and do a cut and come back when the resin is complete. Hello and welcome back. I have finished stirring the resin, and as you can see there are no longer any streaks. I've also let it set for a while so that way the bubbles will float to the top and pop. And there's still a few little tiny bubbles in there, but that's not a big deal. Now for this particular piece, I am actually going to be doing it in 2 layers. The front layer is going to be clear, and that's where I'm going to add this glitter in. So I don't want to fill my mold all the way to the top. I'm only going to fill it partially, part of the way. I'm going to go ahead and pour some of this resin in there. I just want a really thin layer. And I'm going to move some of it around with my stir stick here. And this is a self-leveling resin, which means that it is going to essentially level itself. It's going to just try to go everywhere and keep itself even across the top. Now it's not going to so much as go everywhere as kind of just level itself. You kind of have to push it to where you want it to go. And another thing is that if you miss a spot, sometimes the resin won't move itself there while it's leveling. It'll just go around it. So you want to at least get some resin in every place that you want it to be, and then it will level itself across. Now there are some resins out there that are not self-leveling, so when you do decide to purchase resin, you'll want to check with your manufacturer and see if that is something that it does. Now another tool that I have that is indispensable is going to be a heat gun. And what this does is you turn it on and you just kind of blow it across the top, and it helps to pop any bubbles that have not been popped already. I'm not going to give a demonstration of it in this video because it's really loud and obnoxious, but it is a very useful tool. And now that I've got my first layer of resin poured into this mold, I'm going to go ahead and add my glitter. I don't want a whole lot, I just want some for the glow to kind of darken the glow in spots, that way it's got like little stars. Now this glitter is heavy, so it's going to sink towards the bottom of the mold. Now for this particular project, that is okay for me. The closer to the bottom, or once you pop it out, it will be the top of the piece, the better it is for me. Now if you did not want it to sink and you're using a heavier glitter, all you would do is wait for your resin to start to thicken up, and once it's thick you could then mix it in and it's not going to sink, or it won't sink as much at any rate. I poured a little bit too much there in that corner, but that's alright, and I am just going to go ahead and let it set. Get a little closer view there of the glitter. And once this layer hardens, I'm going to go ahead and pour the next layer, and that is going to be the layer that contains the glow-in-the-dark pigment from solarcolordust.com. Hello and welcome back. Now before we set and pour the next layer here, I wanted to give you a brief look at what the glow-in-the-dark powder looks like before I pour it into the resin. So these are the different powders, and this is a UV light which I'm going to use to quick charge the powders, and so that way we can show a brief glow. So I've turned out the light, and I see this one's already glowing a little just from being out in the light. And you can use the UV light, and you can really charge it really fast just to see it. And there you have it. That's the glow-in-the-dust powder from solarcolordust.com. And our next step will be to mix this in our next layer of resin, and we will finish working on this glow-in-the-dark resin piece. Be back soon. Alright everyone, now it's time to pour our second layer of resin into our mold, and this is the layer that's going to have the glow-in-the-dark pigment from solarcolordust.com. Now I've already mixed up a batch of resin, and this is what I'll be using. And here is where these plastic spoons come in. I use these spoons to mix my pigment because it is a little more shallow than having it all in the cup. And you're just going to pour a little bit in. Well, actually first I'm going to put my pigment in. I'm going to be using this white oil paint, and I'm using this white as a base just to sort of dye the pigment because I want to get more sort of a pastel color. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a little bit at the bottom of the spoon here. And then I'm going to pour a little bit of resin into the spoon. I'm not going to pour the whole batch, just a little bit. And this just makes it easier to mix, so that way I don't have chunks of pigment. And this is where I use my silicone tipped brush. And we're just going to mix it here. I'm just going to keep mixing it until the pigment looks like it's fully incorporated into the resin. And then from here, I'm going to pour this back into the main batch of resin. I'm going to use my mixing spoon to incorporate that pigment into the whole batch of resin. Now, as you can see, I'm not being really gentle in mixing this because I really don't care about the bubbles at this point, because this is going to be a colored piece. Alright, now that I've got that mixed up, I'm going to go ahead and mix my other pigments, my eyeshadow. And since I'm using 3 different colors, I'm going to just put a little bit into each. Alright, so I've got my paddle here. I'm just going to take a little bit of this eyeshadow, dump it into one. Before I get too far with that, I'm going to separate my remaining amount of resin here into these 3 cups. I'm going to take my silicone brush and mix the pigments in. And it's just a lot easier to mix them in the spoons before mixing it with a full batch of resin. You're able to sort of mash it a little more and get the clumps out. And get a smoother consistency. Dump that back into the main batch. And this works really well. This method works really well when you're working, especially with a larger batch of resin. The smaller batch, you could probably mix it in the measuring cup itself, but I still find it easier to mix it in a spoon because of how much shallower the spoon is. To clean off my silicone brush with a baby wipe, and I'm going to move on to the next color. And I use this method when I'm mixing anything with resin, whether it's a liquid pigment or a powder pigment, or a semi-liquid pigment. The only thing I don't really use this method for is glitter, because it's not something that you're trying to blend with the resin to create a color. Like I said, this method works a lot better when you're using more pigment, or more resin. Since I'm using such a little bit here, it's probably not quite as efficient. And again, since I'm using such a little bit of resin, I definitely don't need a whole lot of pigment. Alright, it's not glowing quite as much as I'd like, so I'm going to mix a little more pigment in it. But since you've seen this process already, I'm going to go ahead and do a jump cut to when I'm done mixing everything. Alright, I've completed mixing all the pigments, so next we're going to go ahead and pour them in our mold. I'm just going to use a stir stick, scrape the resin out. As you can see, it's kind of thicker. That's for 2 reasons: because of the length of time it's been sitting here, and also because of the amount of different things I've mixed in it, between the glow-in-the-dark dust and the eyeshadow and the oil. That's going to thicken it up, and it's also going to shorten the amount of time I have to work with it before it starts to harden. It looks like I'm not going to have quite enough resin to fill up the entire mold, but that's alright. What you would do is fill up one of these measuring cups with water, pour it into the mold, and use it to see how much resin you need. I did do that, but apparently I didn't do it accurately enough because it doesn't look like this resin is going to quite fill up the whole mold, but like I said, that's just fine. It'll fill it up enough. Alright, as you can see, I do have a few little bubbles in there, and that's fine. I'm going to let it sit for a while, and either they'll pop, or if they don't pop, I will of course use my handy dandy hot air gun here. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and let this cure, and in the next video we will pop it out and take a look and see what it looks like, and we will also test the glow in the darkness of it. Alright, and so here we are, the moment you've all been waiting for. The resin piece is cured. As you can see, it's not tacky, and we're going to pop it out. Now, sometimes these can be a bit difficult to pop out. One way to prevent that is to use a mold release before you start your pouring. And another way is to put it in the freezer once it's done, and it'll make it easier to pop out. Now this actually isn't quite fully cured. As you can see, it's still bendy, but that's alright. We can still take a look at it. There you have it. And the back has, of course, got this little ridge because I did not fill the mold all the way, but I'll sand that. And I can also add another layer of resin to give this top a bit of a gloss look. So we'll set that down here and mash it a little bit so that way it gets back to its form. And I'm going to grab my UV light. We'll give it a quick charge here and watch the glow in the dust pigment from solarcolordust.com do its work. Alright, let's turn out the lights. Now my camera's not the greatest, so it's not going to pick up the glow quite as well, but there you have it. And the little dark spots that you see are actually the little star-shaped glitter that I poured in there. Now you can see a little better. And there we have it. I'll turn the light back on here. Well, I hope you found this video interesting, and thank you very much for sitting through it with me. I know it's kind of a long video, but it just kind of shows you that resin is not as easy as it looks, and it does take some time, especially if you're wanting to do things like add a glow-in-the-dark effect to it. And if you just want to stay tuned until after the end of the video here, I'll show you some additional pieces that can be created using the glow-in-the-dust powder from solarcolordust.com. Again, thank you for watching.